Welcome to this episode of the Canada History Society series on British Columbia and Confederation. In this, the 11th episode of the Canada History Society's 20-part series, we look at Seward's Folly, the purchase of Alaska. The year was 1867, and the map of North America had begun to shift again, not with the thunder of armies or the roar of cannon, but with the quiet scratch of pen on parchment and the transfer of $7 million in gold-backed bonds. In that year, the United States acquired Alaska from Tsarist Russia, a move derided by many in the American press as Seward's Folly, but which in hindsight was a masterstroke of imperial ambition. To the men who could read maps and anticipate fate, the purchase was not a folly at all. It was chess. In British Columbia, that distant fog-shrouded British outpost clinging to the Pacific was suddenly the peace under threat. At the center of this geopolitical movement stood William Henry Seward, Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, a man whose intellect was sharp, his will granite, and whose vision for America knew no frontiers. As historian Richard Hofstadter observed, Seward was an empire builder in the age of reconciliation. His appetite for expansion had been whetted long before Alaska. He had once predicted, not casually, but with certainty, that the United States would one day absorb not only all of Mexico, but also the entirety of British North America. Our population is destined to roll its restless waves to the icy barriers of the North, he once proclaimed, and to encounter Oriental civilization on the shores of the Pacific. Seward was a prophet of manifest destiny, that combustible mix of American exceptionalism, economic ambition, and Protestant fervor, which insisted that the United States had been appointed by Providence to overspread the continent. The war with Mexico, the annexation of Texas, the occupation of Oregon, these were but stepping stones. In Seward's mind, the Pacific coast was not a terminus, but a gateway, and Alaska was the key to the next door. But the purchase of Alaska was no impulsive grab. Its roots ran into the rivalries of the Old World. Since the early 1800s, Russian fur traders had ventured across the Bering Strait into what they called Russian America. Fort Ross had once stood as far south as California, but the Russian Empire was spread thin. Its treasury led by wars, its navy harried, its ambitions chilled by distance and logistical burden. Then came the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, when Britain and France allied with the Ottoman Empire to smash Russian positions in the Black Sea. The Russian fleet, outnumbered and trapped in its ports, exposed the vulnerability of far-flung possessions like Alaska. St. Petersburg realized that it could not defend such remote holdings in another war with Britain. Worse, Alaska was geographically isolated from Russia and economically disappointing. The Tsar's ministers, calculating in cold Kremlin corridors, decided to sell, but not to Britain, never to Britain. The Tsar had no interest in handing the outpost to his imperial rival. The scars of the Crimean War were too fresh, the rivalry too raw. So in a maneuver worthy of Talleyrand, Russia offered Alaska to the United States, not merely to gain revenue, but to deny it to the British. As historian Donlin Linden put it, Russia sold Alaska to frustrate British ambitions more than to enrich its own coffers. In the quiet corridors of diplomacy, the United States and the Russian Empire concluded one of the most remarkable real estate transactions in world history. For the sum of $7.2 million in gold, the United States acquired the immense and sparsely populated territory of Alaska, amounting to over 586,000 square miles of land. The agreement, formalized in the Treaty of Cession, was signed by U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward and Russian Minister Edouard de Stockel on March 30, 1867, and ratified by the U.S. Senate on April 9th by a vote of 37 to 2. The formal handover occurred on October 18, 1867, at Sitka, in a ceremony marked by military formality and a symbolic flag lowering. In March 1867, the deed was done, and with that transaction, a long arc of geopolitics bent toward British Columbia. For the first time, American territory was non-contiguous. It was now a swath of British land, Canada's western colony, that lay between U.S. Oregon and U.S. Alaska. The logic of manifest destiny demanded a solution. As Arthur R.M. Lower explained, the very map cried out for annexation. A break in the American coastline was not just inconvenient, it was intolerable. The historian Donald Swenson put it more starkly. They could only become so contiguous if the land became Alaska and the Pacific Northwest British Columbia were in some way brought into the American Union. To many Americans of the time, the purchase seemed ludicrous, a frozen wilderness bought at a premium. Critics derided the deal as Seward's folly, or Seward's icebox, unable to see beyond the apparent desolation. Yet Seward himself had no illusions. He believed that Alaska was a strategic gateway to Asia and the Pacific and would become a place of great political and commercial importance. As historian Ronald Takaki later observed, Seward was not buying ice and snow. He was buying distance, position, and future power. Seward understood this. He had always seen British Columbia not as a colony, but an unfinished business. And so in 1869, in the wake of the Alaskan Purchase, Seward undertook to visit Victoria, then the capital of the colony of Vancouver Island. It was not an idle sightseeing tour. The aging secretary came west under the guise of a lecture circuit, but behind the gentlemanly decorum lay strategic intent. The Americans knew British Columbia was teetering, financially strained, politically unsure, and culturally distant from Britain. In Victoria, Seward was feted by the colonial elite. Banquets were held, toasts offered, and speeches exchanged. But beneath the veneer of civility, tension crackled like dry kindling. As historian Margaret Ormsby observed, Seward was not merely visiting, he was measuring. He gauged the loyalties of the merchant class, the mood of the settlers, and the desperation of the colony, surrounded by American power to the south and now to the north. The British, for their part, were rattled. They had shown no interest in acquiring Alaska. Indeed, they had refused to bid. Foreign Secretary Lord Clarendon dismissed the matter curtly, stating that the Hudson's Bay Company already controlled enough ice. It was a strategic blunder, born of imperial fatigue. The British, obsessed with India and the Eastern Question, failed to perceive the growing strategic importance of the Pacific, and now the Americans were poised to dominate it. The British Columbians saw it all too clearly. Encircled by American land, isolated from the heart of empire, and bereft of a railway or even a wagon road to the east, the colony was vulnerable, economically, militarily, psychologically. British Columbia had become an island in a rising American sea. Seward's presence only reinforced the point. If not annexation by force, then absorption by gravity, markets, population, railways, culture. Seward's visit had an effect. It alarmed British officials in London, it disturbed Confederation planners in Ottawa, and it awakened leaders in Victoria. If British Columbia remained a colonial orphan, it might drift, by necessity or invitation, into the arms of the United States. This was the unspoken fear, and it lent momentum to the idea, once fanciful, now urgent, that the colony should join Canada, not for love, but for survival. As historian George Stanley later wrote, Confederation became a necessity not of sentiment, but of strategy. Thus, the Alaska Purchase was not merely a land deal. It was a pivotal point in imperial history, a catalyst that reshaped British Columbia's future. William H. Seward may not have seized the colony, but he forced it to make a choice: to remain adrift in the Pacific or to tether itself, awkwardly, reluctantly, to the emerging nation on the far side of the Rockies. The map had changed, the geography had spoken, and the empire would never again be able to take its Pacific flank for granted. Join us next time for part 12 of the Canada History Society's 20-part series as we explore the Yale Convention, stirrings of a movement to Canada.